A millionaire accustomed to a life of luxury never imagined that a simple visit to one of his hotels would change his life forever. When Ethan Callahan found a waitress unconscious in the storage room from exhaustion, he not only uncovered the harsh reality hidden within his own company, but also found himself irresistibly drawn to her. What started as an act of compassion quickly turned into a forbidden and dangerous love. Sophie, the fiercely independent young woman, not only awakened emotions he had never felt before, but also became the target of a ruthless conspiracy. When her life was put in danger, Ethan realized he had to make a choice: save his empire or protect the woman who made him feel something real. But will he manage to do so before it's too late? Ethan Callahan strode through the gleaming hallways of the Callahan Grand, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. The air was thick with the scent of luxury, a heady mix of expensive perfumes, freshly pressed linens, and the faintest hint of gourmet cuisine wafting from the hotel's five-star restaurant. As the heir to the Callahan Hotel empire, Ethan was accustomed to this rarefied atmosphere, but tonight, something felt different. His steel-gray eyes scanned every detail, looking for imperfections. It was past midnight and most guests were tucked away in their plush suites, but Ethan preferred these late-night inspections. They allowed him to see the hotel as it truly was, stripped of its daytime veneer. As he approached the kitchens, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A young woman in a server's uniform hurried past, her head bowed. Ethan frowned. There was something off about her gait, a slight stumble that spoke of exhaustion. "You there," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. The woman froze, turning slowly to face him. Her face was pale, dark circles prominent under her eyes. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's brow furrowed. He was about to demand why she looked so disheveled when a crash echoed from the nearby storage room. Without a second thought, he strode past the startled server and threw open the door. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Sprawled amidst toppled boxes and scattered supplies lay another young woman, her server's uniform askew, her face ashen. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the scene before him. Then instinct took over. "Help!" he shouted, dropping to his knees beside the unconscious woman. "Someone call an ambulance!" As he gently turned her onto her side, checking for breath, Ethan caught sight of her name tag, Sophie. Her skin was clammy to the touch, her breathing shallow and erratic. What had happened here? Footsteps thundered down the hall as kitchen staff and security personnel rushed to the scene. Ethan barely registered their presence, his focus entirely on the woman before him. For the first time in years, he felt something crack in his carefully constructed facade of indifference. "What happened?" he demanded, looking up at the gathering crowd. "How long has she been here?" The staff exchanged nervous glances, no one wanting to meet his gaze. Finally, an older man in a chef's uniform stepped forward. "Mr. Callahan, sir, I'm not sure. We've been so busy tonight and—" "That's not good enough," Ethan snapped, his voice cold with fury. "I want answers, and I want them now." As if on cue, Sophie stirred, a soft moan escaping her lips. Ethan's attention immediately returned to her, his hand instinctively reaching out to steady her as she tried to sit up. "Easy," he murmured, surprising himself with the gentleness in his tone. "Don't try to move too quickly." Sophie's eyes fluttered, open confusion and fear evident in their depths as she took in her surroundings. When her gaze landed on Ethan, she recoiled slightly, clearly recognizing him. "Mr. Callahan," she gasped, struggling to sit up straighter. "I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to—" "Shh," Ethan interrupted, his hand still on her shoulder. "You have nothing to apologize for. Can you tell me what happened?" "What?" Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting nervously to the other staff members. Ethan followed her gaze, noting the tension in the room. Something was very wrong here, and he was determined to get to the bottom of it. "Everyone out," he ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "Except you," he added, pointing to the chef who had spoken earlier. "I want you to stay." As the room cleared, Ethan helped Sophie to her feet, steadying her as she swayed slightly. He guided her to a nearby chair, kneeling beside her as she sat. "Now," he said, his voice softer but no less intense. I want you to tell me exactly what's been going on here, and I want the truth. Sophie took a shaky breath, her hands twisting in her lap. It's nothing really. I've just been working a few extra shifts, that's all. I guess I overdid it tonight. Ethan's eyes narrowed. A few extra shifts? Enough to make you collapse? He turned to the chef, who was fidgeting uncomfortably. Is this normal? Are all your staff working themselves to the point of exhaustion? The chef's face paled. Mr. Callahan, I can explain. Save it. Ethan cut him off. I want a full report on every employee's hours and working conditions on my desk by morning, and if I find out that this is not an isolated incident, there will be consequences. Turning back to Sophie, Ethan's expression softened. You're coming with me. We need to get you checked out by a doctor. Sophie's eyes widened in panic. No, please, I can't afford. It's not a request, Ethan interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. And you don't need to worry about the cost. I'll take care of everything. As he helped Sophie to her feet, supporting her weight as they made their way out of the storage room, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stumbled upon something far bigger than a simple case of overwork. The fear in Sophie's eyes, the nervous reactions of the staff, it all pointed to a deeper, more systemic problem. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a stirring of something beyond his usual cold efficiency. It was a mix of anger, concern, and a determination to uncover the truth, no matter where it led. As they stepped into the elevator, Sophie leaning heavily against him, Ethan made a silent vow. He would get to the bottom of this, no matter the cost. And in doing so, he had no idea that he was about to embark on a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about his family's empire, about the people who worked for him, and most importantly, about himself. The elevator doors closed, sealing them off from the world they knew and propelling them towards a future neither could have imagined. For Ethan Callahan, the real inspection had only just begun. The soft beep of medical equipment filled the luxurious hospital suite where Sophie lay, her small form dwarfed by the king-sized bed. Ethan stood by the window, his silhouette stark against the twinkling city lights below. His mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information he'd gathered over the past few hours. The doctor's diagnosis had been clear: severe exhaustion, malnutrition, and signs of prolonged stress. It painted a picture far removed from the glossy image Ethan had always associated with the Callahan brand. He turned, his gaze falling on Sophie's sleeping form. In the harsh fluorescent light, the dark circles under her eyes were even more pronounced, her cheekbones too sharp for someone her age. A soft knock at the door broke his reverie. "Come in," he called, keeping his voice low. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman in a crisp suit, her expression a mixture of concern and trepidation. "Mr. Callahan," she began, "I'm Amanda Reeves, the HR director for the Callahan Grand. I came as soon as I heard." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "And what exactly have you heard, Ms. Reeves?" Amanda shifted uncomfortably. "That one of our employees collapsed during her shift. I assure you, Mr. Callahan, this is highly unusual. We have strict policies in place to—" "Spare me the corporate speak," Ethan interrupted, his voice cold. "I want to know how this happened, and I want to know now." Amanda hesitated, her eyes darting to Sophie's sleeping form. "Perhaps we should discuss this outside." Ethan shook his head. "No, whatever you have to say, you can say it here. She deserves to hear it, even if she's not awake to do so." Taking a deep breath, Amanda began to speak. As she talked, Ethan felt a growing sense of horror and disgust. The picture she painted was one of systematic exploitation, cut corners, manipulated schedules, and a culture of fear that kept employees from speaking out. "So you're telling me," Ethan said, his voice dangerously low, "that our own management has been running what amounts to a sweatshop in one of the most luxurious hotels in the country?" Amanda flinched at his words. "Mr. Callahan, I wouldn't put it quite like that. We've been under a lot of pressure to cut costs and increase efficiency. Some compromises were made." "Compromises?" Ethan spat the word out. "Is that what we're calling it now? Look at her, Ms. Reeves, really look at her. Does she look like an acceptable compromise to you?" Before Amanda could respond, a soft moan came from the bed. Sophie was stirring, her eyes fluttering open. Ethan was at her side in an instant, his earlier anger giving way to concern. Where am I?" Sophie mumbled, trying to sit up. "Easy," Ethan said, gently helping her. "You're in the hospital. You collapsed at work, remember?" Recognition dawned in Sophie's eyes, quickly followed by panic. "Oh God, my shift! I need to get back. I can't lose this job. Shh," Ethan soothed, surprising himself with his gentleness. "You're not going anywhere right now, and you certainly don't need to worry about your job." Sophie's eyes darted between Ethan and Amanda, who stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed. But Ms. Reeves here was just explaining to me some of the issues at the hotel," Ethan said, his voice hardening as he glanced at the HR director. "I'd like to hear your side of the story, Sophie, if you're up for it." Sophie hesitated, her hands twisting the blanket. I don't want to cause any trouble." "You're not causing trouble," Ethan assured her. "You're helping me understand." "What's really happening in my hotels, please, Sophie? I need to know." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Sophie took a deep breath and began to speak. Her story unfolded slowly at first, then in a rush, as if a dam had broken. She spoke of grueling shifts that stretched far beyond what was legal, of managers who turned a blind eye to exhaustion and illness, of a constant fear of losing the job she desperately needed. "My little sister Lily," Sophie said, her voice cracking. "She depends on me, our parents, they're gone. It's just us. I can't let her down. I can't." Ethan felt something twist in his chest, a feeling so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. Compassion. He reached out, hesitating for a moment before gently taking Sophie's hand in his own. "You haven't let anyone down," he said firmly. "The people who were supposed to protect you, to protect all our employees, they're the ones who failed." He turned to Amanda, his eyes blazing. "I want a full audit of every hotel in our chain, staffing, scheduling, pay, everything, and I want it done by an independent firm. No more internal cover-ups." Amanda nodded, her face pale. "Of course, Mr. Callahan, I'll get started right away." As she hurried from the room, Ethan turned back to Sophie. "I promise you things are going to change, but right now, you need to rest and recover." Sophie's eyes were wide with disbelief. Why are you doing this? For me, I mean." Ethan paused, realizing he didn't fully understand his own motivations. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because you made me see something I should have seen a long time ago." As he spoke, Ethan felt something shift within him. The cold, calculating businessman was still there, but alongside him now stood someone new, someone who cared, who wanted to make a difference. "Get some rest," he told Sophie gently. "I'll be back to check on you in the morning." As he left the hospital room, Ethan's mind was already racing with plans. He had a long night ahead of him, filled with phone calls, emails, and the beginnings of what would become a massive overhaul of the Callahan hotel empire. But even as he threw himself into the work, a part of him kept drifting back to that hospital, room to the young woman whose courage had shaken him to his core. Sophie had shown him a world he'd been blind to, and in doing so, she'd awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. As the first rays of dawn broke over the city, Ethan stood in his office looking out over the skyline. The Callahan Hotel stood proud and gleaming, testaments to his family's success. But now, for the first time, he saw beyond the glittering facades to the lives within, lives he had a responsibility to protect. He made a silent vow then, not just to Sophie, but to all the unseen faces who made the Callahan empire possible. Things would change. He would make sure of it. Little did Ethan know that this was only the beginning. The path he had set himself upon would lead him into conflict with those closest to him, challenge everything he thought he knew about business and success, and ultimately force him to confront the man he had become and the man he wanted to be. As he turned back to his desk, ready to begin the monumental task ahead, Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. And with it, a determination to see this through, no matter the cost. The following weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Ethan threw himself into the task of reforming the Callahan Hotel empire with a fervor that surprised even his closest associates. Board meetings that had once been dry affairs, focused solely on profit margins, now became heated debates about employee welfare and ethical business practices. Ethan sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his posture rigid as he faced down the skeptical faces of the board members. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. "Gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice steady. Despite the opposition he knew he was about to face. "The reports from our independent audit are in. The results are disturbing, to say the least." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. Some of the older board members shifted, uncomfortably in their seats, while others wore masks of stony indifference. "Systematic exploitation of our staff, dangerous working conditions, wage theft. The list goes on," Ethan continued, his tone hardening. "This isn't just a moral failing, it's a legal and financial time bomb waiting to explode." "Now see here." "Ethan," interrupted Gerald Hawthorne, one of the oldest and most influential board members, "we've always operated within the bounds of the law. These so-called exploitations are simply efficient business practices. Your father understood that." Ethan felt a flash of anger at the mention of his father, but he kept his composure. "My father is not here, Mr. Hawthorne, I am, and I'm telling you that things are going to change." He laid out his plan. Increased wages, better working conditions, comprehensive benefits packages, and a complete overhaul of the management structure to ensure accountability at every level. The room erupted into chaos. Voices shouted over one another, faces red with anger and disbelief. "This is madness. We'll be bankrupt within a year. The shareholders will have our heads." Ethan let the storm rage for a moment before raising his hand for silence. When he spoke again, his voice was low but carried an undercurrent of steel that made everyone in the room take notice. "I'm not asking for your permission, gentlemen. I'm informing you of what will happen. Those who cannot or will not adapt to these changes are free to tender their resignations, effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood, buttoning his jacket. "I expect your full cooperation in implementing these changes. Good day, gentlemen." As he strode out of the boardroom, Ethan could feel the weight of their stares on his back. He knew he had just made powerful enemies, but for the first time in his life he felt truly alive. Back in his office, Ethan loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of water, his hand shaking slightly as the adrenaline began to wear off. A soft knock at the door made him turn. "Come in," he called, expecting it to be his assistant with more reports. Instead, Sophie stood in the doorway, looking hesitant but determined. She had recovered well in the weeks since her collapse, though Ethan noted she still looked too thin, too fragile. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he took in Sophie's appearance. Despite her hesitation, there was a fire in her eyes that both intrigued and unnerved him. He gestured for her to enter, setting aside the paperwork he'd been poring over. "Sophie," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended, "I didn't expect to see you here. Is everything all right?" She stepped into the office, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her simple blouse. "Mr. Callahan, I came to thank you and to ask for my job back." Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her. The Sophie before him was a far cry from the unconscious girl he'd found in the pantry. Her chin was lifted defiantly, though he could see the slight tremor in her hands. "Your job?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I thought we'd discussed this. After what happened, I can't in good conscience." "With all due respect, Mr. Callahan," Sophie interrupted, her voice firm. "I don't need your conscience, I need to work. Your sister is being taken care of," Ethan reminded her gently. "I've made sure of that." Sophie's eyes flashed. "And I'm grateful, truly. But I can't keep accepting your charity. It's not right." Ethan stood, circling his desk to stand before her. Up close, he could see the faint shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "It's not charity, Sophie. It's the least I can do after what my company put you through." She shook her head, a strand of hair falling loose from her ponytail. "You didn't know. You're not responsible for—" "I am," Ethan insisted, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "I should have known. I should have paid attention to what was happening in my own hotels. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words and conflicting emotions. Ethan found himself acutely aware of how close they were standing, of the faint scent of lavender that clung to Sophie's skin. "Let me help you," he said softly. "Not as your boss, not as some billionaire throwing money around. Let me help you. As a friend." Sophie's eyes widened slightly at the word friend. She searched his face as if looking for some hidden agenda. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why do you care so much?" It was a question Ethan had been asking himself for weeks. Why did this one woman matter so much? Why couldn't he get her out of his mind? "Because," he began, then paused, struggling to find the right words. "Because you made me see, really see for the first time in years, the people behind the numbers, the lives affected by every decision I make." Sophie's expression softened slightly, but she didn't back down. "That's very noble, Mr. Callahan, but it doesn't change the fact that I need to stand on my own 2 feet. For my sister's sake and for my own." Ethan nodded slowly, an idea forming in his mind. What if I offered you a different position? Something that would allow you to use your skills to make a real difference in how this company treats its employees? Sophie's brow furrowed. "What kind of position?" "A consultant," Ethan said, warming to the idea. "You've seen firsthand the problems in our system. Who better to help us fix them?" For a moment, Sophie looked taken aback. Then, a slow smile spread across her face. "You're serious?" "Completely," Ethan assured her. "It won't be easy. You'll face resistance from people who don't want things to change. But if you're up for the challenge..." Sophie's smile widened, a spark of excitement in her eyes. "When do I start?" As Ethan began to outline the details of the new position, he couldn't help but feel a sense of lightness he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was doing something truly meaningful. But even as hope blossomed in his chest, a nagging worry tugged at the corners of his mind. He knew that not everyone would be happy with these changes. Some people had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, no matter the cost. As he watched Sophie's animated face, listened to her passionate ideas for improvement, Ethan made a silent vow. He would protect her no matter what. He wouldn't let anyone harm her or derail the changes they were about to set in motion. Little did he know, the challenges they would face were far greater than either of them could have imagined. Forces were already aligning against them, setting in motion a chain of events that would test not only their resolve, but the very foundations of everything Ethan had built. As Sophie left his office that day, her head held high and a new sense of purpose in her step, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that their lives had just irrevocably changed. For better or worse, only time would tell. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Sophie threw herself into her new role with a passion that both impressed and slightly intimidated Ethan. She pored over employee records, conducted interviews and compiled reports that laid bare the systemic issues plaguing the Callahan hotel chain. Ethan found himself spending more and more time with Sophie, ostensibly to discuss her findings and recommendations. But as the days turned into weeks, he couldn't deny that there was more to it than that. He found himself looking forward to their meetings, savoring the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her ideas, the way her brow furrowed in concentration as she pored over spreadsheets. It was during one of these late-night strategy sessions that everything changed. They were in Ethan's office, papers strewn across his desk, empty coffee cups littering the surface. Sophie was in the middle of explaining her latest proposal when she suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice hesitant. "Ethan, can I ask you something?" He looked up, surprised by the use of his first name. "Of course. What is it?" Sophie bit her lip, seeming to gather her courage. "Why are you really doing all this? I mean, I know you said you wanted to make changes, but this goes beyond that. You're risking a lot. Your reputation, your family's trust." Ethan leaned, back in his chair, considering her words. He could have given her a pat answer about corporate responsibility or long-term business strategy. But as he looked into her earnest eyes, he found himself wanting to tell her the truth. "When I found you that night," he began slowly, "it was like waking up from a long sleep. I'd been going through the motions for so long, focused on nothing but the bottom line. But seeing you there, knowing what you'd been through, it made me realize how far I'd strayed from the person I wanted to be." Sophie's eyes widened slightly, but she remained silent, listening intently. "This company," Ethan continued, gesturing around them, "it was my father's dream, but somewhere along the way it became a monster, chewing up people like you and spitting them out. I won't let that continue." He stood up, moving around the desk to stand in front of Sophie. "You asked me why I care so much. The truth is, Sophie, you've changed me. You've reminded me of what's really important, and I can't go back to who I was before." For a long moment they stood there, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then, slowly, Sophie reached out and took Ethan's hand. "Thank you," she said softly, "for trusting me with the truth." As their eyes met, Ethan felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name. It was more than attraction, more than admiration. It was a connection he'd never experienced before, a feeling of rightness that both exhilarated and terrified him. But before either of them could say anything more, a sharp knock on the door shattered the moment. Ethan's assistant burst in, her face pale. "Mr. Callahan," she said, her voice shaking, "there's been an incident at one of the hotels. A fire. They're saying it wasn't an accident." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. He turned to Sophie, seeing his own fear reflected in her eyes. This was it, he realized. The pushback they'd been dreading. Someone was sending them a message. As they rushed out of the office, Ethan's mind raced. He'd known there would be resistance to the changes they were implementing, but this was beyond anything he'd imagined. Who would go to such lengths? And more importantly, how far were they willing to go? One thing was clear. The stakes had just gotten much, much higher. And as he glanced at Sophie's determined face beside him, Ethan knew that there was no turning back now. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The drive to the hotel was tense, filled with a heavy silence punctuated only by the occasional update from Ethan's security team. As they pulled up to the scene, the flashing lights of fire trucks and police cars cast an eerie glow over the familiar facade of the Callahan Grand. Smoke still billowed from several windows on the upper floors, and the acrid smell of burning permeated the air. Ethan's stomach twisted as he took in the scene, his mind racing with thoughts of the guests and staff who might have been hurt or worse. As they exited the car, Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, her eyes wide with horror. Ethan instinctively reached for her, his hand finding the small of her back. "Stay close," he murmured, guiding her through the chaos towards the police cordon. A harried-looking detective approached them, his face grim. "Mr. Callahan? I'm Detective Ramirez. We've got the fire under control, but what?" Ethan demanded, his heart pounding. "Was anyone hurt?" The detective hesitated, his eyes flicking to Sophie before returning to Ethan. "No serious injuries, thankfully. But, sir, we found something. In the room where the fire started." He held out a singed piece of paper in an evidence bag. Ethan took it, his blood running cold as he read the message scrawled in angry red letters. "Back off, Callahan. This is your only warning." Sophie leaned in to read the note, her face paling. "They know," she whispered. "They know what we're doing." Ethan's jaw clenched, a mixture of anger and fear coursing through him. He turned to the detective, his voice low and urgent. "I want every piece of security footage, every witness statement. Whoever did this, I want them found." As the detective nodded and moved away, Ethan felt Sophie's hand on his arm. He turned to find her looking at him with a mixture of determination and fear. "We can't stop now," she said firmly. "If we do, they win." Ethan studied her face, marveling at her strength in the face of such blatant intimidation. He nodded slowly. "You're right, but Sophie, this is getting dangerous. I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," she interrupted, her chin lifting defiantly. "I'm telling you, I'm in this, Ethan, all the way." The use of his first name, so rare from her lips, sent a jolt through him. In that moment, Looking into her eyes blazing with determination, Ethan realized something that both thrilled and terrified him. He was falling in love with Sophie. The realization hit him like a physical blow, leaving him momentarily breathless. It was as if the chaos around them faded away, leaving only Sophie, her face illuminated by the flashing lights, her eyes locked on his. But the moment was shattered by the approaching footsteps of Ethan's head of security, his face grim. "Sir," he said urgently, "we've got a problem. Someone's been accessing confidential files, employee records, financial data. It looks like we've got a mole in the company." Ethan felt the world tilt beneath his feet. A mole. Someone on the inside working against them. The implications were staggering. He turned to Sophie, seeing his own shock and fear mirrored in her eyes. "We need to go," he said quietly. "It's not safe here." As they made their way back to the car, Ethan's mind raced. Who could be behind this? Who stood to lose the most from the changes they were implementing? One name rose to the forefront of his mind, a name that filled him with a mixture of dread and anger. Victor Callahan. His own uncle, the man who had been running the day-to-day operations of the company for years, while Ethan focused on expansion. If Victor was behind this, Ethan's fists clenched at his sides. The betrayal cut deep, but it also steeled his resolve. He would not let his family's legacy become one of exploitation and corruption. As they drove away from the scene of the fire, Ethan reached over and took Sophie's hand. She looked at him, surprise and something softer flickering in her eyes. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "we're in this together. I won't let them hurt you, Sophie. I promise." She squeezed his hand, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the gravity of the situation. "We'll protect each other," she replied. As they sped through the night, the city lights blurring past the windows, Ethan felt a strange mix of fear and hope. They were up against powerful forces, people who wouldn't hesitate to destroy lives to protect their interests. But looking at Sophie, feeling the warmth of her hand in his, Ethan knew they had something their opponents didn't, a genuine desire to do good, to make things right. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to see them through the storm that was coming. Little did they know the fire was just the beginning. In the days and weeks to come, they would face challenges that would test not only their resolve, but the very foundations of their budding relationship. As they arrived at Ethan's penthouse, the safest place he could think of, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the precipice of something much bigger than either of them had anticipated. The game had changed, the stakes raised, to dangerous heights. But as he looked at Sophie, her face set with determination even as exhaustion pulled at her features, Ethan felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over Ethan's penthouse. Sophie had spent the night in one of the guest rooms, neither of them willing to risk her returning to her apartment after the events at the hotel. Ethan found her in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee and staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city below. She looked small and vulnerable in the oversized t-shirt and sweatpants he'd lent her hair pulled back in a messy bun. "How did you sleep?" he asked softly, not wanting to startle her. Sophie turned, offering him a wan smile. "As well as can be expected, I suppose. You?" Ethan shrugged, moving to pour himself a cup of coffee. The truth was he'd barely slept at all, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. "We need to talk about what happens next," he said, leaning against the counter. "Things are complicated now." Sophie nodded, her expression turning serious. "I've been thinking about that. Ethan, if your uncle is really behind this, then we're dealing with someone who knows the company inside and out," Ethan finished. "For her. Someone with connections, resources, and a lot to lose if we succeed." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the soft hum of the city far below. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "We can't back down, you know that, right? If we do, everything we've worked for, everything we've risked, it will all be for nothing." Ethan studied her face, marveling at the strength he saw there. Despite everything, despite the danger and the uncertainty, Sophie was still fighting. It made his heart swell with admiration and something deeper, something he wasn't quite ready to name. "I know," he said softly. "But Sophie, I need you to understand something. From here on out, it's going to be dangerous. Really dangerous. I won't ask you to put yourself at risk like that." Sophie's eyes flashed, a spark of the fire he'd come to admire lighting up her face. "You're not asking, Ethan. I'm telling you. I'm in this, all the way. Those people, the ones we're fighting for, they're my friends, my co-workers. I won't abandon them now." Ethan felt a surge of emotion so strong it almost overwhelmed him. Without thinking, he closed the distance between them, cupping Sophie's face in his hands. "You are the most remarkable person I've ever met," he said softly, his thumbs tracing the curves of her cheekbones. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Sophie's eyes widened, her lips parting slightly. Ethan felt himself leaning in, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. But before their lips could meet, the shrill ring of Ethan's phone shattered the moment. He stepped back, his heart pounding as he fumbled for the device. "Callahan," he answered, his voice rougher than usual. As he listened to the voice on the other end, his expression darkened. Sophie watched, her own face growing concerned. "I understand," Ethan said finally. "We'll be there." He hung up, turning to Sophie with a grim expression. "That was my lawyer. The board has called an emergency meeting. They're trying to force me out." Sophie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "They can't do that, can they?" Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "With enough votes, yes. And if my uncle has been planning this..." He trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air between them. If Victor had been working behind the scenes, turning the board against Ethan, they could be facing a coup. "What do we do?" Sophie asked, her voice small but determined. Ethan straightened, a plan already forming in his mind. "We fight, we go to that meeting, and we show them exactly what's at stake. But first..." He moved to his desk, pulling out a small, innocuous-looking device. "We need to make sure we have proof. This is a recording device. I want you to wear it to the meeting. If anyone says anything incriminating..." Sophie nodded, understanding, dawning in her eyes. "We'll have them on record." As they prepared for the meeting, gathering documents and steeling themselves for the confrontation to come, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But looking at Sophie, seeing the determination in her eyes, he knew they had no choice. Whatever happened in that boardroom, it would change everything. The future of the company, their fight for justice, and the fragile, unspoken thing growing between them, it all hung in the balance. As they left the penthouse, Ethan reached for Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. She looked up at him, small smile playing at her lips despite the gravity of the situation. "Together?" she asked softly. Ethan nodded, feeling a surge of determination. Together? Little did they know, the storm they were about to walk into would test them in ways they could never have imagined. The boardroom awaited, and with it, a battle that would determine not just the fate of Callahan Hotels, but the very course of their lives. The sleek elevator ascended silently, carrying Ethan and Sophie towards the top floor of Callahan Hotel's corporate headquarters. The tension was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan's jaw was set, his eyes focused on the climbing floor numbers, while Sophie fidgeted with the hidden recording device, ensuring it was securely in place. As they approached the executive level, Ethan turned to Sophie, his expression softening for a moment. "Remember," he said quietly, "no matter what happens in there, we're doing the right thing. Don't let them intimidate you." Sophie nodded, squaring her shoulders. "I won't," she promised, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing a corridor of polished marble and dark wood. At the end, two imposing doors led to the boardroom. Ethan took a deep breath, then strode forward, Sophie matching his pace. As they entered, the buzz of conversation died immediately. A dozen pairs of eyes turned to them, some curious, others openly hostile. At the head of the long table sat Victor Callahan, Ethan's uncle, his silver hair gleaming under the recessed lighting, his face an impassive mask. "Ethan," Victor said, his voice deceptively pleasant. "How kind of you to join us, and Miss Wright, what an unexpected surprise." Ethan's hand found the small of Sophie's back, guiding her to 2 empty seats. "Sophie is here as my advisor," he said firmly. "She has valuable insights that the board needs to hear." A murmur rippled through the room. Victor's eyes narrowed slightly, but he nodded. "Very well. Shall we begin?" What followed was a grueling 3 hours of accusations, rebuttals, and thinly veiled threats. Ethan and Sophie presented their findings on the company's labor practices, the exploitation of workers, and the long-term damage it was doing to both the employees and the Callahan brand. But for every point they made, Victor and his allies on the board had a counter-argument. Profits were up, they insisted. Change was risky, the current system worked. As the meeting wore on, Sophie could see Ethan's frustration growing. His knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of his chair, and a muscle ticked in his jaw. But he never lost his composure, countering each argument with facts and passion. Finally, Victor leaned back in his chair, a small, triumphant smile playing at his lips. "I think we've heard enough," he said smoothly. "It's clear that while Ethan's idealism is admirable, it's not in the best interest of this company. I move that we take a vote on whether to retain Ethan as CEO or to relieve him of his duties." A shocked silence fell over the room. Ethan sat very still, his face pale but determined. Sophie felt her heart racing, knowing that everything they'd worked for hung in the balance. But before the vote could be called, she stood up suddenly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. All eyes turned to her, surprise and curiosity evident on most faces. "Before you vote," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "there's something you need to hear." With shaking hands, she reached for the recording device, praying it had captured what they needed. As she pressed play, Victor's voice filled the room, tinny but unmistakable. "I don't care what it takes. Burn it down if you have to. We can't let Ethan and that little waitress ruin everything we've built. Do you understand?" The color drained from Victor's face as the recording continued, detailing his involvement in the hotel fire and his plans to sabotage Ethan's efforts. The boardroom erupted into chaos, members shouting over each other, demanding explanations. In the midst of the uproar, Ethan stood, his voice cutting through the noise. "I think," he said coldly, "that we have a new matter to vote on. The immediate removal of Victor Callahan from all positions within this company and a full investigation into his actions." The next hour was a blur of legal discussions, hurried phone calls, and shell-shocked board members trying to distance themselves from Victor's actions. By the time it was over, Victor had been escorted from the building by security, and Ethan's position as CEO was not only secure, but strengthened. As the last of the board members filed out, leaving Ethan and Sophie alone in the suddenly too quiet room, the full weight of what had just happened settled over them. They had won, but at what cost? Ethan slumped into a chair, running a hand over his face. "I can't believe it," he murmured. "My own uncle." Sophie moved to his side, hesitating for a moment before placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, Ethan. What he was doing, and it had to be stopped." He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "We did the right thing," he corrected softly. "I couldn't have done this without you, Sophie." Their eyes met, and in that moment all the unspoken feelings that had been building between them seemed to crystallize. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Ethan reached up and cupped Sophie's face in his hands. "Sophie," he whispered, But before he could finish, the boardroom door burst open. Ethan's assistant rushed in, her face pale. "Mr. Callahan," she gasped. "There's been another fire at the hotel where Ms. Wright's sister works." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Sophie stumbled back, her eyes wide with horror. "No," she whispered. "No, it can't be." Ethan was on his feet in an instant, his arm around Sophie's waist, supporting her. "Call my driver," he barked at the assistant, "and get me an update on the situation, now." As they rushed from the boardroom, the victory they had just achieved felt hollow. They had won the battle, but the war, it seemed, was far from over. Victor's final act of revenge had struck at the heart of what mattered most to Sophie, and by extension to Ethan. In the elevator, descending far too slowly, Ethan held Sophie close. She was shaking, her face buried in his chest. "We'll find her," he promised fiercely. "Whatever it takes, Sophie, I swear to you, we'll find your sister." As the elevator doors opened and they rushed towards the waiting car, Ethan's mind raced. They had exposed Victor, but clearly his reach extended further than they had imagined. How deep did the corruption go? And more importantly, how far would their enemies go to protect themselves? One thing was certain: the game had changed. What had started as a fight for workers' rights had become a dangerous web of corporate espionage, family betrayal, and now a direct threat to the people they loved. As the car sped through the city streets, sirens wailing in the distance, Ethan knew that the real battle was only just beginning. And this time, the stakes were higher than he could have ever imagined. The car weaved through traffic at a breakneck pace, Ethan's driver expertly navigating the congested city streets. Sophie sat rigid beside him, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. Ethan held her hand tightly, his thumb tracing soothing circles on her skin, even as his own heart raced with anxiety. "We're almost there," he murmured, more to fill the suffocating silence than to provide any real comfort. Sophie nodded mutely, her gaze fixed on the approaching chaos ahead. As they neared the hotel, the scene that greeted them was one of controlled pandemonium. Fire trucks lined the street, their lights casting an eerie red glow over the gathering crowd. Thick, acrid smoke billowed from several windows on the upper floors, and the air was filled with the shouts of firefighters and the hiss of water from powerful hoses. Before the car had fully stopped, Sophie was out the door, Ethan close behind her. They rushed towards the police cordon, Sophie's eyes frantically scanning the crowd of evacuated guests and staff. "Emily!" she called out, her voice cracking with desperation. "Emily!" A young police officer moved to intercept them, his hand raised. "I'm sorry, but you can't." Ethan stepped forward, his voice low and authoritative. "I'm Ethan Callahan. This is my hotel. We need information about an employee, Emily Wright." The officer's eyes widened in recognition, but before he could respond, a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Sophie! Sophie!" They turned to see a young woman, no more than 20, pushing through the crowd. Her dark hair was disheveled, and soot streaked her face, but she was alive and seemingly unharmed. "Emily!" Sophie cried, relief flooding her voice as she rushed to embrace her sister. The two women clung to each other, both trembling with emotion. Ethan hung back, giving them space, but his mind was already racing. This was no coincidence. The timing, the target, it all pointed to a calculated move by Victor or his associates. As Sophie and Emily's reunion continued, a grim-faced detective approached Ethan. "Mr. Callahan, I'm Detective Ramirez. We spoke at the last incident." Ethan nodded, his jaw clenching. "What do we know?" Ramirez glanced around, then lowered his voice. "It's definitely arson. Same mo as the last fire, but this time we found something else." He held out an evidence bag containing a singed piece of paper. Ethan's blood ran cold as he read the message scrawled in now familiar red ink. "You should have listened, Callahan. Next time we won't miss." Ethan's fists clenched at his sides, a mixture of rage and fear coursing through him. They had escalated from warnings to outright threats, and worse, they had nearly hurt Sophie's sister, the one person who meant everything to her. He turned, back to where Sophie and Emily still stood, now talking quietly, Sophie's arm protectively around her younger sister's shoulders. The sight of them, vulnerable yet resilient, steeled Ethan's resolve. "Detective," he said, his voice low and determined, "I want every resource you have on this. Security footage, witness statements, forensic evidence, everything. Whoever's behind this, I want them found, now." Ramirez nodded, his expression grave. "We're doing everything we can, Mr. Callahan, but off the record, whoever this is, they've got connections, high-level connections. This goes beyond just your uncle." Ethan's mind raced, piecing together the implications. If Victor wasn't working alone, if there were others involved, the scope of the corruption could be far wider than they'd imagined. As the detective moved away to coordinate with his team, Ethan approached Sophie and Emily. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. "We can't stay here," Ethan said softly. "It's not safe. I'm taking you both to my penthouse. We'll figure out our next move from there." Sophie nodded, tightening her arm around Emily. "Okay," she agreed, her voice hoarse. "But Ethan, what's going on? Why are they targeting Emily?" Ethan's expression darkened. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I promise you, Sophie, I'm going to find out, and I'm going to put a stop to this, no matter what it takes." As they made their way back to the car, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the crowd, noting several faces that seemed too interested, too focused on their movements. Once they were safely in the vehicle, speeding towards the relative security of his penthouse, Ethan allowed himself a moment to breathe, but the respite was short-lived. His phone buzzed with an incoming message, the number blocked. With a sense of foreboding, he opened it. A single line of text glowed on the screen. "You should have listened, Callahan. This is just the beginning." Ethan's blood ran cold as he read the message. He glanced at Sophie, who was staring out the window, her face pale and drawn with worry. He decided not to share the threat with her just yet. She was already dealing with enough. As they pulled up to Ethan's building, a thought struck him. "Wait," he said to the driver. "Take us to St. Mary's Hospital instead." Sophie turned to him, confusion and hope warring in her eyes. "Do you think—" Ethan nodded, taking her hand. "If there were injuries from the fire, that's where they'd be taken. It's our best bet to find your sister." The drive to the hospital felt interminable. Sophie sat rigid beside him, her hand clutching his so tightly it almost hurt. Ethan didn't mind. He welcomed the connection, the tangible reminder that they were in this together. As they rushed into the emergency room, the chaos was overwhelming. Nurses and doctors hurried past, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the sharp tang of disinfectant. Ethan approached the reception desk, his presence commanding immediate attention. "We're looking for Emily Wright," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "She would have been brought in from the Callahan Hotel fire." The poor nurse tapped at her computer, her brow furrowed. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't have anyone by that name listed." Sophie made a small distressed sound beside him. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her close. "Please," he said to the nurse, "check again. She's 19, brunette. She might have been admitted under a different name." As the nurse resumed her search, Ethan's phone buzzed again. Another message from the blocked number. "Tick-tock, Callahan. How many more will suffer before you back down?" Ethan's jaw clenched, a mixture of rage and fear coursing through him. He was about to respond when Sophie gasped beside him, "Emily!" Across the waiting room, a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Sophie was being wheeled in on a gurney. She was conscious but clearly in pain, her face smudged with soot. Sophie broke away from Ethan, rushing to her sister's side. Ethan followed close behind, his heart pounding. "Em, oh God, Em," Sophie was saying, grasping her sister's hand. "Are you okay? What happened?" Emily coughed, her voice raspy as she replied, I don't know. There was smoke everywhere. Someone pulled me out." As the doctors wheeled Emily away for treatment, promising Sophie they'd update her soon, Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had pulled her out. Was it a random act of heroism or something more calculated? He turned to Sophie, who was watching the doors her sister had disappeared through, tears streaming down her face. "Sophie," he said gently, "we need to talk." She looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed but alert. "What is it?" Ethan took a deep breath. I think Emily might have been targeted. To get to us." Sophie's eyes widened in horror. "What? But why? How?" Ethan pulled out his phone, showing her the messages. "Whoever is behind this, they're not stopping at the company. They're coming after the people we care about." Sophie's face hardened, a determination settling over her features that Ethan had come to admire. "Then we fight back," she said firmly. "We find out who's doing this, and we stop them. For good." Ethan nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. "We will. But first we need to make sure you and Emily are safe. I have a place, a safe house of sorts. We'll go there as soon as she's released." As they settled into chairs to wait for news on Emily, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He scanned the waiting room, noting exits, potential threats. The game had changed, become infinitely more dangerous. But looking at Sophie, seeing the strength and determination in her eyes, he knew they would face it together. Hours passed in a tense blur of coffee cups and hushed conversations. Finally, a doctor emerged with news. Emily was stable, suffering from smoke inhalation, but expected to make a full recovery. The relief that washed over Sophie was palpable, and Ethan found himself pulled into a tight embrace. As he held her, feeling her warmth against him, Ethan made a silent vow. He would protect these women, this family that had somehow become his own. Whatever it took, whatever the cost, he would see this through. But even as hope blossomed in his chest, a nagging fear persisted. Whoever was behind this, they were powerful, ruthless, and always one step ahead. The real battle, Ethan knew, was just beginning. As they prepared to move Emily to the safe house, Ethan's phone buzzed one last time. The message that appeared sent a chill through his very core. "Run all you want, Callahan. You can't hide forever, and neither can they." Ethan's grip on the phone tightened, his jaw clenching. They were being hunted, that much was clear. But what their enemies didn't realize was that they had awakened something in Ethan, a fierce protectiveness, a determination that bordered on obsession. He looked at Sophie, helping her groggy sister into a wheelchair, and felt a surge of emotion so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. In that moment, he knew there was nothing he wouldn't do to keep them safe. As they left the hospital, stepping into the cool night air, Ethan was acutely aware of the shadows around them. The potential, threats lurking in every corner. But he was also aware of something else, a strength he hadn't known he possessed, born from the fierce love and loyalty he felt for the two women beside him. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, Ethan knew one thing with absolute certainty: he would not back down. The fight had become personal, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to win. The safe house was a nondescript brownstone in a quiet neighborhood, far removed from the glittering skyscrapers of Ethan's usual world. As they pulled up, Ethan scanned the street, his senses on high alert for any sign of danger. "It's clear," he said softly, helping Emily out of the car while Sophie gathered their hastily packed bags. "Let's get inside quickly." Once inside, Ethan engaged a series of sophisticated security measures, retinal scanners, reinforced doors, and a state-of-the-art alarm system. Sophie raised an eyebrow, impressed despite the circumstances. "You came prepared," she remarked. Ethan's lips quirked in a humorless smile. "In my position, you learn to expect the unexpected." As they settled Emily into one of the bedrooms, Ethan couldn't help but notice the way Sophie fussed over her sister, her face etched with worry and guilt. Once Emily had drifted off to sleep, exhausted from her ordeal, Sophie slumped against the doorframe, looking utterly drained. Ethan approached her cautiously, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You should rest too," he said softly. "I'll keep watch." Sophie shook her head, her eyes meeting his with a fierce determination. "No, we need to plan our next move. Whoever is behind this, they're not going to stop." Ethan nodded, admiring her resilience, even as he worried about her pushing herself too hard. "All right, but first let's get some food in you. We need to keep our strength up." In the kitchen, as Ethan prepared a simple meal of sandwiches and soup, Sophie paced, her mind clearly racing. "We need to figure out who's behind this," she said, her voice low but intense. "It can't just be your uncle. He doesn't have this kind of reach from jail." Ethan nodded, his expression grim. "You're right. Victor must have partners, people with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. The question is, who?" Heather began to piece together what they knew. The attacks had escalated from corporate sabotage to outright violence. Someone with significant resources was pulling the strings, someone who stood to lose a lot if Ethan's reforms went through. "What about the board members?" Sophie suggested. "Any of them seem particularly opposed to the changes?" Ethan's brow furrowed in thought. "Marcus Devereaux," he said slowly. "He's been on the board for years, and he's always been resistant to any kind of change. Plus, he has connections in industries that benefit from our current labor practices." Sophie's eyes lit up with recognition. Devereaux. I've heard that name before. Some of the workers mentioned him, said he was known for being particularly ruthless. As they continued to brainstorm, connecting dots and following leads, Ethan couldn't help but be impressed by Sophie's sharp mind and intuitive leaps. She was more than just an ally in this fight. She was a true partner. Suddenly, Sophie gasped, her eyes wide. Ethan, what if it's not just about the hotels? What if there's something bigger going on? Ethan leaned forward, intrigued. What do you mean? Sophie's words tumbled out in a rush. Think about it. The scale of this operation, the resources they're using. What if the hotels are just a front for something else? Something illegal? The idea hit Ethan like a thunderbolt. It made a terrible kind of sense. The unexplained profits, the resistance to oversight, the extreme measures to maintain control. Money laundering, he breathed. Or worse. And if that's true, then we're dealing with more than just corrupt businessmen, Sophie finished. We could be up against organized crime. The weight of this realization settled over them, heavy and ominous. The stakes had just risen exponentially, and the danger they faced was far greater than they had imagined. Ethan reached across the table, taking Sophie's hand in his. Sophie, if this is true, it's not safe for you to be involved anymore. You and Emily should go, get as far away from this as possible. Sophie's eyes flashed with anger and determination. Don't you dare try to sideline me now, Ethan Callahan. We're in this together, remember? Besides, her voice softened slightly, I couldn't leave you to face this alone. The emotion in her voice, the fierce loyalty in her eyes, stirred something deep within Ethan. Without thinking, he leaned across the table, his free hand cupping her cheek. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, with a gentleness that belied the tension of the moment, Ethan's lips met Sophie's. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, then deepening as Sophie responded, her hand threading through his hair. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. We'll figure this out, he promised. Together. Sophie nodded, a small smile playing at her lips despite the gravity of their situation. Together, she agreed. As they sat there, hands intertwined, the weight of their discovery hung heavy in the air. They were no longer just fighting for workers' rights or corporate reform. They were up against a powerful, ruthless enemy who would stop at nothing to protect their illegal operations. But looking into Sophie's eyes, seeing the strength and determination there, Ethan felt a surge of hope. They had uncovered the truth, and now they had the power to expose it all. The path ahead would be dangerous, fraught with challenges they could scarcely imagine. But they would face it side by side, their bond forged in the fire of adversity and strengthened by the tender feelings blossoming between them. As the night deepened around the safe house, Ethan and Sophie began to formulate a plan. They would need evidence, allies, and above all, courage, but with each other's support, they felt ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did they know, their enemies were already closing in, setting in motion a chain of events that would test their resolve, their loyalty, and the depths of their newfound love in ways they could never have anticipated. The next few days passed in a blur of frantic research, hushed phone calls, and tense strategy sessions. Ethan and Sophie worked tirelessly, piecing together the complex web of corruption that had ensnared Callahan hotels. Emily, still recovering from her ordeal, provided valuable insights from her time as an employee, filling in gaps in their knowledge. As they delved deeper, a disturbing picture began to emerge. The money laundering operation was vast, spanning multiple countries, and involving several high-ranking executives. Marcus Devereaux, it seemed, was just the tip of the iceberg. On the third day, as Ethan pored over financial records he had secretly obtained, Sophie burst into the room, her face pale. "Ethan," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "I think I found something, but it's bad. Really bad." She handed him a stack of papers, printouts of emails and encrypted messages she had managed to intercept. As Ethan read, his blood ran cold. The corruption went far beyond money laundering. There were hints of human trafficking, using the hotel chain as a front for moving people across borders. "My God," Ethan whispered, his hands shaking. How did I not see this? Sophie placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. You couldn't have known, Ethan. They went to great lengths to hide it. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing the room. We need to take this to the authorities now. But as he reached for his phone, Sophie caught his wrist. Wait, she said urgently. We need to be smart about this. If these people are as connected as we think they are, going to the wrong person could be disastrous. Ethan paused, realizing she was right. They needed a plan, someone they could trust absolutely. As if on cue, Ethan's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, but something made him answer. Mr. Callahan, a gruff voice said, this is Detective Ramirez. We need to talk. Ethan's eyes met Sophie's, a mixture of hope and apprehension passing between them. Could this be the ally they needed? Detective, Ethan replied cautiously, I think you're right, but not over the phone. Can you meet us? After arranging a secure meeting location, Ethan turned to Sophie. This could be our chance, he said. But it could also be a trap. Sophie nodded, her jaw set with determination. We'll be ready for either. As they prepared to leave the safe house, Ethan couldn't shake a feeling of foreboding. They were about to take a huge risk, potentially exposing themselves to their enemies. But they had no choice. The stakes were too high. Just before they left, Ethan pulled Sophie aside. Whatever happens, he said softly, cupping her face in his hands, I want you to know that meeting you, it changed everything. You made me see what really matters. Sophie's eyes glistened, with unshed tears as she leaned into his touch. We'll see this through, Ethan, together. Their lips met in a kiss that was both tender and fierce, a promise and a declaration. When they parted, both felt strengthened, ready to face whatever lay ahead. As they drove through the night-shrouded city towards their meeting with Detective Ramirez, neither Ethan nor Sophie spoke. The weight of what they were about to do, the lives that hung in the balance, pressed down on them. Suddenly, a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror, approaching fast, too fast. Ethan, Sophie said, her voice tight with alarm, I think we're being followed. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he accelerated, weaving through traffic. The car behind them matched their pace, drawing closer. Hold on, Ethan growled, making a sharp turn down a side street. The chase was on, a high-stakes game of cat and mouse through the urban landscape. Ethan's years of defensive driving training kicked in as he maneuvered the car with precision, but their pursuers were relentless. Just as it seemed they might shake them, a second car appeared, cutting off their escape route. Ethan's mind raced, searching for a way out. Sophie, he said urgently, in the glove compartment. There's a USB drive with everything we've uncovered. If anything happens to me, you need to get that to Ramirez. Sophie's eyes widened in fear and determination. Nothing's going to happen to you, she insisted, even as she clutched the drive. As their options dwindled, Ethan made a split-second decision. He spotted a narrow alley, barely wide enough for their car. It was risky, but it was their only chance. Brace yourself, he warned, before wrenching the wheel hard. The car scraped against the walls of the alley, sparks flying, but they made it through. Behind them, they heard the screech of brakes as their pursuers were forced to abandon the chase. Breathing hard, Ethan guided the damaged car to a stop in a deserted parking lot. He turned to Sophie, his heart pounding. Are you okay? She nodded, her face pale but resolute. We need to keep moving, on foot. As they abandoned the car and melted into the shadows of the city, Ethan felt a mix of fear and exhilaration. They were in danger, yes, but they were also close to exposing the truth. And with Sophie by his side, he felt ready to take on the world. Little did they know their ordeal was far from over. As they made their way towards their rendezvous with Detective Ramirez, forces were aligning against them, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. The night was far from over, and dawn, when it came, would bring with it revelations that would shake the foundations of everything Ethan and Sophie thought they knew. As Ethan and Sophie hurried through the dark streets, their senses on high alert, the city seemed to close in around them. Every shadow held potential danger, every passing car a possible threat. They moved quickly but cautiously, making their way to the rendezvous point where Detective Ramirez awaited. Finally, they spotted the nondescript coffee shop where they'd agreed to meet. Through the window, they could see a solitary figure in a booth, nursing a cup of coffee. Ramirez. Ethan squeezed Sophie's hand. "Ready?" She nodded, her face set with determination. "Let's finish this." As they entered the shop, Ramirez looked up, his weathered face unreadable. "Mr. Callahan, Ms. Wright. Glad you made it." They slid into the booth across from him, tension thrumming through their bodies. Ethan produced the USB drive, sliding it across the table. "Everything we've uncovered is on here, Detective. The money laundering, the human trafficking, it's bigger than we ever imagined." Ramirez pocketed the drive, his expression grim. "I've been working this case for years," he said quietly, "but I could never get enough evidence. Until now." For the next hour, they talked in hushed tones, sharing information and piecing together the full extent of the corruption. As dawn began to break outside, casting a pale light over the empty streets, a plan began to take shape. "We'll need to move fast," Ramirez said. "Once we start making arrests, they'll try to cover their tracks. We'll need your testimony, both of you." Ethan and Sophie exchanged a look, a silent communication passing between them. They knew the risks, but there was no turning back now. "We're in," Ethan said firmly, "whatever it takes." As they left the coffee shop, the city coming to life around them, Ethan felt a strange mix of fear and hope. They were on the precipice of something huge, something that could change everything. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Ramirez's team moved swiftly, executing coordinated raids across the country. Ethan and Sophie worked tirelessly, providing information and identifying key players. It wasn't without danger. There were close calls, moments when it seemed their enemies might gain the upper hand. But through it all, Ethan and Sophie stood strong, their bond deepening with each challenge they faced. Finally, after what felt like weeks but was only days, it was over. The arrests were made, the evidence secured. The Callahan Hotel empire, once a bastion of corruption, was being dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. As Ethan stood in his office, looking out over the city, he felt a presence behind him. Sophie approached, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head on his shoulder. "We did it," she said softly. Ethan turned, pulling her into a proper embrace. "No," he corrected gently. "You did it. You opened my eyes, Sophie. You made me see what really mattered." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with emotion. "So what happens now?" Ethan smiled, a genuine, hopeful smile that reached his eyes. Now we rebuild. We make this company what it always should have been, a force for good, for fair treatment and honest work." Sophie's face lit up with excitement. "We?" "Yes, we," Ethan confirmed, taking her hands in his. "If you'll have me as a partner, in business and in life." Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she nodded, words failing her. Instead, she pulled Ethan into a deep, passionate kiss, pouring all her love and hope for the future into it. As they stood there, silhouetted against the city skyline, Ethan marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter in a hotel pantry to partners in every sense of the word, facing down corruption and danger together. He knew there would be challenges ahead, rebuilding the company, regaining the trust of employees and the public, navigating their new relationship. But with Sophie by his side, Ethan felt ready to face anything. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow across the sky, Ethan and Sophie looked out at the world they had helped to change. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a start. A new beginning, full of hope and possibility. And as they stood there, hand in hand, they knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. Two unlikely allies turned lovers, united by a shared vision of justice and a love that had been forged in the fires of adversity. The road ahead would be long, but with each other's support and the strength they had found within themselves, Ethan and Sophie were ready to build a future, brighter than either of them had ever dared to dream.